Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear ambassadors, dear friends. Let me welcome you to the 8th International Symposium on the Czech Foreign Policy. Thank you very much for coming. I know it's a very busy time, start of the academic year and basically of the diplomatic year. So it's a great pleasure to see the great hall filled with great people. I will immediately pass the floor to the director of the Institute of International Relations, who kindly prepared the introductory remarks for the symposium. So once again, thank you very much for coming, and we have 2 days full of joy and discussions ahead of us.
Thank you, Michal. I'll start with my joyful introductory remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to officially open International Symposium Czech Foreign Policy. As Michal already mentioned, this is the 8th installment of our symposium, so we are slowly but inexorably approaching our 10th anniversary, and with it the maturity of our symposium. The symposium has, I believe, firmly believe, become an established format for asking pertinent but often uncomfortable questions, often pointing to gaps and omissions and problems of foreign policy, both Czech, regional and European. And one such problem is the problem of strategy, which will be the main topic of this year's symposium. In fact, strategy is an interesting notion. We always complain, and I believe that the humankind has always complained about a lack thereof. We want to have a master plan. We want to have a guarantee that we are prepared for everything, for every eventuality. And this call for strategy often goes hand in hand with our yearning for security, for the reduction of the complexity of our world. Now, while, as I said, this has always been the case, there is something special about our times. Somehow this yearning is even stronger. Ulrich Beck talks about the risk society. Anthony Giddens has famously defined our society as a society increasingly preoccupied with the future and also with our safety, which generates and self-generates the notion of risk. Now, but here, I believe, lies the paradox. We want to prepare for the unpredictable. We want to rationally devise a plan for something that is in the end unforeseeable. Now, interestingly, the original Greek notion of strategia is translated as art of leading. So it's not really about reason, about rationality. It's about intuition, about creativity, about charisma, as the Greeks used to say, about gifting, gifted people who somehow intuit the course of the future. So it's more about creativity than about contingency plans. And this is the big challenge, how to balance these two elements. On the one side, our rational deliberations, our developing future scenarios on the one hand, and on the other, acknowledging that there is always something that we cannot ultimately rationally analyze or predict, that there indeed always is an element that remains a mystery, remains hidden from our side. Of course, our symposium today will not solve this eternal conundrum, but I hope that it will shed some light on the way or the directions in which our strategic thinking is developing. And as I said, we are very proud of not being afraid to ask uncomfortable questions here, and I'm sure we will face or tackle these questions today as well as tomorrow. Is there an illiberal turn happening in the Visegrad Four? Are the Czech strategic relations with Germany at jeopardy? Do we have any clue about what is happening in the neighborhood and how to solve the problems, and so on and so forth? All these questions, I'm sure, will be discussed here. But none of this would be possible without the support of our institutional partners, and B, without having such great speakers here this year. Our main partner is, as always, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm really grateful for their openness in this regard, because what we are discussing here is often quite critical, I believe constructively critical, of Czech foreign policy, and it requires a magnanimous spirit on the part of Czech diplomats to be open to these discussions. But I believe that Czech diplomats, or at least some of them, have proved to be ready to think about these challenges, and we are grateful for that. Also, I would like to thank our other institutional partners, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in the first place this year, who have been very kind in supporting our symposium. But there is also a number of distinguished speakers we'll be listening to today and tomorrow. I'd like to mention just a few of them. Professor Charles Gati in the first place of Johns Hopkins University. Tomorrow we'll have the opportunity to discuss EU global strategy with Natalie Toci, one of the main engines behind the strategy. We have a number of distinguished diplomats such as Jakub Dyr, Jiří Šedivý, Stefan Füle, who will be discussing all these challenges with us in our panels, as well as the breakout sessions. So let me wish you a successful conference, a lot of new ideas, and perhaps a slightly better picture of what foreign policy strategy is about and where we are heading. Thank you.
Thank you, Petr, very much. Thank you for joining us here. I will have a few technical remarks after the opening address that will be very soon made by our distinguished guest, Professor Charles Gati. What we will do is Charles was kind enough to prepare a presentation or an opening speech for about 40 minutes. And then we will have some time for a discussion. I'm extremely happy that Charles was able to join us this year. It's the second time that he came to our symposium. If there is someone in Washington that has an extremely deep knowledge about Central Europe and about the world in general, then it's Professor Gati. I have to correct the title that is in the program. Professor Gati is a senior research professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Why I am mentioning it is because there are only two scholars with this title, with the title of senior research professor, and it's Charles Gati and Zbigniew Brzezinski. So
not in that order.
Not in that order. Okay, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Charles Gati. Thank you. And Professor Gati, I don't think there is much of a need to introduce him to you, but let me just say that in his professional life, Charles combines the executive, let's say, expertise with a scholarly world, which is something that we appreciate very, very deeply. The title of his presentation is an easy one. Why is our world so troubled in 2016? And because I'm really looking forward to what Charles has to say, I will stop here and I will enjoy the presentation. Charles, thank you again for coming here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind, overly generous introduction. It's not only that I was here in this room speaking because of your invitation 3 years ago, but my memory actually goes back to previous encounters here in Prague, which I consider the most beautiful city in Europe. Right after that, I hasten to add, is Budapest, where I was born, so I'd better mention Budapest, which is an extraordinarily beautiful city as well. But this is, yesterday I just took a big walk here in Prague. It's like walking in a museum. I don't know how come you cannot enjoy every minute of it. In any case, I've been here before, and my memory goes back actually to a couple of funny encounters back in 1989. Some of you probably were not yet born then. I remember coming here, and the talk of Prague at that time was something that I could not understand since I don't speak Czech. But wherever I went, people talked about a speech, a garbled and I think fairly stupid speech made by the leader of the Communist Party at the time, Jakeš, and that was, so there is somebody here who remembers this, I guess, and this was broadcast back by Radio Free Europe in Czech, and at times, you know, laughter can do as much harm as straight opposition, and I think he was laughed out of power in some ways because of that speech. Another memory I have was actually in this building. Just a couple of years after that, in 1991, I came here to visit the then Foreign Minister, Jiří Dienstbier, with whom I had many friendly encounters in the 1980s, and I liked him very much. And I hope I'm not revealing here anything I shouldn't, but this place was completely disorganized at that time. This was just after the momentous changes, and as I remember, he slept here. He either didn't have time or didn't want to go home or whatever, so he received me in his jeans and his slippers. And you know, one does not associate a foreign minister of a great country receiving a visitor in the slippers, but that was 1991, the changes, and now, of course, it's a different place, and it's wonderful to be back here. I mean, there are more serious recollections I have, obviously. Anybody who follows Central Europe knows the names of Kafka and listens to Dvorak and Smetana, and it's just a wonderful place here, and it's very nice. Thank you very much for inviting me back. I gave this very provocative title to my talk for a good reason, not because I have a good answer to the question. I have several answers, and then you can consider them as you wish, but because this very ambitious topic points to something extremely important, which is that we live in a dangerous world. This is most unusual. In my long experience following international relations for more years than I care to remember, I have not encountered a year or a couple of years when things seem so confused, so troubled, so disorganized, lacking a structure that is essential in international politics. So what's so wrong? Well, you know this, so this I will not discuss in detail, just give you 8 sets of events that trouble me greatly, and then I will try to answer the question why, instead of describing the events themselves with which you are all very familiar. Well, I would mention in the first place the barbarian killings that go on by ISIS and others, terrorism throughout the world, including, of course, much of Europe and North America too, let alone the Middle East. Number 2 is the heartbreaking war, a never-ending war in Syria, and the destruction of that country and its neighborhood, plus the refugees. Now the third point, the refugees that try to leave destruction behind and live a normal life. That is very familiar to me because under very different circumstances. I was once a refugee many, many decades ago, and I have to tell you that my experiences as a refugee after 1956, my experiences were simply great, and I'm very grateful to Americans especially, but also to Germans who helped me at that time. I miss the generosity of the human spirit these days. But that was an editorial comment. Let me go to the next point. There is a fourth troublesome event or series of events. Is the weakening of the appeal of European integration. I'm referring here primarily to Brexit, which is, I think, a catastrophic development, removing a very important part of the European Union from the European Union, with consequences that I can't yet foresee, but they're not going to be good. Fifthly, we see Russian aggression abroad and increasing authoritarianism at home. And similarly, we see China's, not necessarily aggression, but China's moves in the South China Sea, which are, those moves are incomprehensible at a time when China needs the outside world for, at least for trade relations. And of course, Chinese authoritarianism, as in Russia, remains a problem for those of us who care about democracy. Seventh, I'm almost at the end of the list, is the growing threat from North Korea. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but this is a nuclear threat to our civilization, and in a few years, nuclear missiles by North Korea will be able to reach not only South Korea and Japan, but at least the western parts of the United States and Canada as well. And finally, and I am about to discuss that in more detail, there is the United States. Its political deadlock at home, the inability of the system to produce legislation and to produce advances, and America's declining influence abroad, which I believe is a major problem in that the structure of the post-Cold War world has been built on American influence, and that is now, I think, in serious decline. So the question is not so much that any one of these events is unfortunate or awful. They are. But the question is together. When you put just these 8 developments, and you can add another 8 yourselves, these developments together pose, I think, a very serious threat to the international system. All the more so because there is a great deal of comfort around the world. Nothing seems to shake up our confidence that things will simply go on the way they always have, and that peace, and in Europe at least, peace and prosperity will continue as they have. I believe that's a very misleading and unfortunate reaction to these new developments. So the question then is, are there any common causes for these, to repeat, dangerous events and developments? I believe there are, and let me discuss 5 of them. The first one is the domestic reorientation of the United States, America's domestic reorientation. And I will start this discussion by describing a personal experience. As I just alluded to it before, I left Hungary after the Soviet intervention of 1956, and I studied at Indiana University, right in the middle of the United States. And my new friends, student friends, in the spring of 1958 said, this is a time, mind you, I was a lot younger then, this is a time to look for girls in Florida. This was springtime, and it's a tradition of college students in America in the spring to go to Florida, particularly to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where the quote-unquote, where the girls are. I believe there was a song as well as a movie about this as well. So we got into a big car, and 6 of us or 7 of us in one car, and we went from Bloomington, Indiana to Fort Lauderdale. We had to stop once, and that was in the state of Georgia. And we stopped in a motel, and in the motel, I could never forget this, the neon light said, no niggers, no Jews, no dogs. This was 1958 in the southern part of the United States. The northern part was quite different already, but this was in the south of the United States. Now let me jump from there to 1964, a critical year in American domestic politics, where after the death, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the country was ready to listen to the new president, Lyndon Johnson, all the more so because he was a brilliant politician. He knew how to twist arms as well as to charm people in the Congress. And something new began. The new thing, together with Martin Luther King in 64, 65, was the uprooting of American society. Blacks, women, later on homosexuals, began to move, and indeed, in my judgment, legally speaking at least, have moved towards equality, something that had not been known in the United States when I arrived there, as late as that, let alone decades or a century before that. And there was even something called affirmative action, which meant that blacks, and in some cases maybe women, received advantageous treatment when they applied to universities. That was controversial from the beginning, and I don't need to tell you that white males, some, for example, who applied to some of the universities where I taught, were not entertained by the idea that somebody, just because of the color of his skin, would have an advantage getting into a university. And yet, social progress dictated that something be done. But this was not all positive. This was not all a victory. There were not all winners. The winners were who got into the universities or who got a job, maybe, but there were losers. The losers were primarily white males. And what we see now is a reaction to that, as well as a reaction to the changes, profound changes in immigration laws. Few people understand what 1965 immigration laws did to the very character of the United States, which is to say, the advantage that was given to whites coming from Europe, European white, that's just changed. And it was eliminated. And so now other criteria produced other people coming to the United States, not just European whites, but rather the leading countries from where they came were Mexico, China, Korea, and etc. Now again, I'm going to jump here. A new America, fighting for diversity, accepting equality by most, but not by all, culminated in the election of the first black president in the person of Obama. This is how you should understand what's happening today. What's happening today is a counter-revolution to the enormous changes that took place over a period of 50 years. 1964, 2014, more or less, those were the decades that I'm referring to. And the result is Donald Trump and his efforts to take advantage of the feeling widespread among white males, particularly uneducated types who have been sidetracked by progress, by women taking positions that they used to have, for example. They feel victimized. They are victims. You should understand this because in Central Europe, the idea of victimization is a part of your political culture very much, more so maybe in Poland and in Hungary than here. But the idea that outsiders, others, take advantage of you is a part of the fabric of Central European life. So what you have is a wide backlash today that may or may not produce the presidency of Donald Trump. I don't have to tell you from what I have said, you can figure out that I would be most unhappy if that were to happen. But in addition to that, there is another phenomenon, which is that the country is tired also, is tiring, I should say. This new society is tiring of international engagement. And so together, when you have this, you have a new situation, a new America with a new kind of engagement in the outside world. Now this brings me to the second underlying current in international politics today, which is that the United States is no longer as dominant as it used to be, and no one else is quite catching up. Now I think that in terms of military or economics, I think the facts speak for themselves. The United States is still the leading country in the world. In other ways too. In education, I would say, however awful our high schools are, and you can see those scores where in mathematics, I think the United States is 27th, for example, when it comes to high school graduates, which is not what it should be. But our graduate schools are different. In the top 20 universities in the world, more than half are in, many more are in America, and this is not American listing, this is a Chinese listing that I looked up. So if the Chinese say that most of the best universities are in America, I think we should more or less accept that, although I can't stand these listings just between us, but except when they praise Johns Hopkins University, then I feel very good. So what we have here is, well, also in culture, for example, just ask yourself this question: how many Chinese or Russian or any other, let's say, film stars you know? And probably you know several Americans. When it comes to films, for example, the United States remains a dominant power in the world, but it's not what it used to be. And China and Russia have not caught up with the United States. Frankly, I think in my lifetime they won't, because their domestic political order does not produce the results that they would otherwise like to have. So what we have here is imbalance, both in terms of hard power and soft power. The United States remains number one, but don't be misled by that. It's not the domination that there was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or certainly during the Cold War. And I think Americans understand it. And the subjective reaction to that, well, if we can't make such a big difference and nobody listens to us, then let's come home. That's part of the appeal of Trump as well, who says America first. Let me make America first and America great. A very misleading and unfortunate comment, but that may be my opinion, and that's unfortunately irrelevant. What matters is that it resonates with at least 30, maybe 35% of the American public. And that is just too many, because this sort of thing appeared before in American history. I could talk about that endlessly here, and they would get 5, 10% of support. This is very different now. So in terms of geopolitics, we have an uneven and frustrated world in which Russia especially would like to resurrect its superpower glory. They seek revenge for having lost it at the end of the Cold War, and they are working very hard to exploit America's relative decline or relative weakness from being the superpower it used to be. The third element of international politics that I consider quite important is a nationalist revival, which points to the atomization of world politics. My main example here is Europe, because this is what would be of greatest interest to you, and it seems that integration is beginning to take a back seat to this nationalist revival. The memories of World War I and World War II seem to be fading, and too many people, maybe not majorities, or not majorities yet, seem to believe that we should take peace and prosperity of the last 70 years or so for granted. This is a big mistake. We should remember, in my opinion, that the only wars we have had in Europe since the end of World War II were in the Balkans. They were awful, terrible, but the rest of Europe has lived in peace, under oppression, to be sure, in the eastern part, but since then in freedom and peace and relative prosperity, or at least improved circumstances. This may come to an end with the current trend of a nationalist revival. I mean especially in the political realm. Don't exclude the possibility of wars, which is the traditional basic point of departure in analyzing European history. How many wars did we have, not just World War I and World War II, in this continent before that, and how little we have had in the last 70 years. You change the structure of the last 70 years, which some countries or some leaders are so inclined to do, and you will have the old structures back, the old problems, and that's not patriotism, though that's part of it, obviously, but rather it is nationalism, which means that you consider somebody else inferior to yourself. Now, what we see here is the glorification, increasingly the glorification of the nation state, and empty talk about absolute sovereignty, which was a myth even in 1648 when the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. Even then, there was no such thing as absolute sovereignty, which some political movements or parties or even prime ministers seem to advocate. The problem is that Brussels is hardly perfect, and many things have been done by and for the European Union that were probably excessive. Too much centralization, too much bureaucracy. And Euroscepticism has a base, has some reason. There is some reason to be skeptical about the European Union. I read that even here in the Czech Republic, only 25% of the public committed to the European Union. That's too low. It's not the worst in Europe, but it is among the worst ones, and it's very upsetting and unfortunate in my judgment. So, but however many mistakes we can cite about the European Union, the alternative is far worse. And that is what the point that I want to emphasize. So what we are seeing here is we are witnessing the beginnings of the decomposition of European unity, and the proponents of European unity seem to be on the defensive and occasionally saying silly stuff, like the foreign minister of Luxembourg, I think the other day, said that Hungary ought to be kicked out of the European Union. And, you know, that's an interesting proposition, except that he has to know that it's not possible to do it. And so therefore it is superfluous to go into that, because it would take years and years of consensus that would never be achieved by the European Union. Now, I focused here on Europe only, but this nationalism is pervasive. It is everywhere in the world, and it is against working together, and I believe that it is a source of our troubles. The fourth point, getting to the less obvious points, has to do with the rise of emotional politics worldwide. Previously, too, when I would teach freshman students about politics, I would point out that political decisions in general, by the public and by leaders too, is a composition of emotional reactions and rationality, the calculation of what is good for the country or good for groups or parties or whatever on the one hand, and an emotional reaction which we do or do not control. Today, we have the same thing, except that rationality is being left behind. There's less calculation, much more emotional reactions on the part of the public. And I'll talk about that in just a moment in a different sense. And when it comes to that, then we have serious problems. So let's just consider, for example, let me pick on one of your neighbors here, Poland. Poland gets from the European Union about 15 billion euros a year. And yet, the new Polish government is working very hard to delegitimize the European Union. Now, for the life of me, I can't explain this in rational terms. I mean, I was taught when I was a student and I got my PhD that one ought to be able to explain things in rational terms. Well, how do you, I hope somebody in the audience will be able to tell me what sense it makes in rational terms, not emotional terms, but rational terms, because emotionally it's obvious. I don't like to be the poor guy around. I don't want to be seen as taking somebody else's money. Besides, they set conditions about my sovereignty. Emotionally, I can explain all this, but I hope somebody can help me understand in rational terms. If you get, and you travel in Poland, as I do every now and then, they do write up, this road was built by the European Union. So it's not that they hide it. They know that their development is a function of assistance by taxpayers, rich taxpayers in the European Union. And yet, they started now a very serious campaign to undermine the legitimacy of the European Union. I could talk about other countries as well. Russia is a case of emotional politics, big time. It's a country that feels humiliated, and humiliation is a very important topic in the study of psychology. And when you feel humiliated, as so many Russians do, I think the overwhelming majority, then your reactions become emotional. What do I mean by humiliation? Very briefly and superficially. What I mean is they've lost their superpower status, and President Obama, in a very bad, unfortunate comment, even referred to Russia as a regional power. You could not have said the word, something more insulting than that to a great country, large, and a country with certainly with a culture that we all admire, maybe culture of the 19th century and not the 20th, but in any case, it's because the fact of the matter is that Russia is a regional power. And so he told the truth, but occasionally presidents probably should tell the truth to their wives or others in great confidence, if them. And we have humiliation elsewhere. We have it in the Middle East. What is this uprising by the jihad? But a reaction to humiliation, maybe belated. I don't know exactly why now. Don't ask me that. I don't know why, but they were exploited by the Turkish Empire, the French Empire, the Brits, and then came the Americans in Iraq and committed huge crimes against humanity. So they are responding to that kind of humiliation, to the loss of self-respect. And therefore, the reaction is very much emotional rather than rational. And so what we see elsewhere in the world, too, is that differences among countries that should be discussed and rationally mediated cannot be done. It is not done. There are emotional reactions, including increasingly, perhaps only in this campaign year, in the United States. Now, this discussion of emotional politics leads me to my last point. That's probably the most unexpected of what I have to say here, and that is something new of the last 10, 20 years, the negative impact of new technologies on world politics. Now, I have in mind especially the internet, which I believe is both a curse and a blessing. I also use it all the time, and what would I do given my fading memory without Google? We all resort to that, of course, and it's wonderful. But just think of the negative side for a change. On the internet, everybody is an expert. Now, you may say that I, as a professor, I'm jealous of that, or I don't like it. And you are right. I don't. When I write something and somebody somewhere in the world, you know, writes under that what an idiot I am, or whose interests I serve, or my mother must have been this or that, and you know, the language is particularly insulting. Well, yeah, I do have a standard that people with knowledge should be addressing serious issues more than others. I'm not against democracy at all. They can vote, but there is something here about the internet freeing the spirit and allowing people, at times using their names, at times anonymously, to be vindictive and to be nasty and worse. I'm sure you see this, the so-called comments sections under articles or some of these blogs are horrendous. They are really just awful, insulting, and usually very, very ignorant. Now, in effect, hostility is free now on the internet. That did not used to be the case. That did not used to be the case. There was a price to be so very hostile to others, which is that, well, you can call it politically correct, but if that's what it means to be politically correct, that you are civilized, and you don't attack everybody with whom you disagree, well, then I like being politically correct. Then it is the right way to proceed, but it's impossible today. I don't know how many of you care about the study of psychoanalysis, but Sigmund Freud was born here in Moravia, so you'd better have a little respect for them, for your for the man. He was talking about hostile instincts, and he called them id, I-D in English. I forgot what the German word was, maybe the same. And so I made up this word. I wrote an article, and I tried to be witty. I liked it, I have to tell you that. And I wrote, the lid is now off the id. The lid is off the id. And I think that summarizes where we are today. All these hostilities, which one did not encounter because they were suppressed, certainly not publicized, I think now have surfaced on the internet, and the awful comments show up anonymously or otherwise all the time. Now you may say, well, why do you bother to read it? You don't have to read it. Nobody compels you to read it. Well, sure. That's very true, and I try not to read it because it does upset me. My blood pressure goes up some of the time when I read this nonsense and insults, especially when they are directed against me or my friends. But the point is not that. The point is something else. These people are now part of the political process. They are there's important political participation by people who know nothing except how to insult others. and they have, I think, led world politics in the wrong direction. And yes, you may call me an elitist if you want to, that's fine, I will accept that. But I think those with knowledge should assert themselves and not allow ignorance to take over. And yet the internet is a source of great ignorance. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the new technologies are both a curse as well as a blessing. Okay, so these are the 5 explanations, not very satisfactory, of the troubled times that we have. Permit me to end with an editorial. This is not as bad as 1933 or 1939 or 1914. But I think we do live in a very dangerous world that calls for new answers and new approaches. There is just too much violence, too much vulgarity, and this is a very American expression. I don't know if all of you understand it. There is now a situation when nobody minds the store. Nobody is in charge. And another expression is, when the cat's away, the mice will play. I know you will all understand that. I have no solution to offer, unfortunately, but I want to share a belief with you, which is that it's not over, though. Despite everything you have just heard the last 35 minutes from me, it's not over. I think the children of light, as Niebuhr called them, the children of light can still put up a good fight against the children of darkness, and I hope that you are among them. The children of light are today for integration, they are for diversity, and they are for reaching out to refugees. I believe that this, I will end here by calling your attention to a very inspiring moment that I caught on YouTube, which I know you can get on your internet. It may be paradoxical that I am asking you to use the internet after all that I had said, but on the YouTube from 1989, as I prepared for this talk, I found a song that I particularly liked. In '89, the American folk singer Joan Baez came here and sang "I Believe" at Wenceslas Square with Václav Havel in attendance, and occasionally Havel tried to get in. He didn't know all the words. It's a little awkward. But then, I guess, when they sang it in Czech, then Havel cut in and he joined it. And the song they sang in English was "We Shall Overcome." And in Czech, it's "Jednom budem dál." And I believe that that is still our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, very much. It was an impressive tour of our troubles, and thank you for the positive ending. I just cannot help but to say that two things are standing, in my opinion, really high. Is the fact of humiliation, because we can see that here in Central Europe, how much the so-called leaders are exploiting the feeling of humiliation. And the second thing is the emotional politics and the rise of nationalism, which I think has a common denominator in the fact that everyone is confused. The politicians, the people are confused, lacking the understanding of what is going on in the world, and that just all together plays very well into the emotional politics. I would like to ask Petr if you would like to have a few comments on this brilliant speech, and thank you very much again.
Thank you. Well, I could not agree more. So thank you very much for the speech. But I still have some comments, perhaps asking for some clarifications. I really appreciate it, and Michal already mentioned that we all do realize that we are at a time when politics of identity and politics of emotions is gaining the upper hand, clearly. It is important to hear for us in the region that there is a global trend there, because sometimes, and that I think is important to stress, is that people from the region have a kind of essentialist understanding of the region and our problems, basically saying, well, this is exactly what is happening here, but not elsewhere, and we still look up to those mature, developed democracies that are not having these problems. And it's good to hear that there are some common causes, common problems that cut across. Of course, there are some regional contexts, some regional differences, but there is some general trend. Now that is the good thing to hear. Now the bad thing is then that, the question, what can be done with that? Because clearly, just this week, Foreign Affairs published an article entitled "The Return of the Nation State." So basically echoing what you are saying, that there is a rise of nationalism all across the globe, but particularly in Europe, the rise of the nation state, and this is something that is deeply troubling for me. And I don't have the answers, but and that's why I'm asking more senior people to ask them what can be done there. Because I'm a great believer in deliberation, in convincing people by argumentation, but clearly this is failing. It is failing all across the world. It is failing, and if we, all the problems we are facing are increasingly of a global or at least transnational nature, but the solution that is given and that is increasingly appealing to people is, let's take back control, to quote an unnamed country's referendum campaigners. Take back control, let's return to our national borders, as if you could fight climate change by erecting walls on the borders between your country and the next one. So this is the troubling thing for me, and the big question, what can we do countering this trend? And finally, in more, perhaps slightly more theoretical terms, the argument about the distinction between rational arguments and emotional arguments, I sometimes wonder, because when talking to my Russian friends, for instance, many of them, even educated people, would say that they feel a deep sense of satisfaction from having Crimea back, basically. So you could rephrase it in utilitarian terms if you wanted. You could say, well, based on their understanding of the world and what gains means for Russia, they gained something and they really feel satisfied. I mean, 80% obviously of the Russian population, even without the manipulated opinion polls, clearly there is a huge majority of people who are satisfied with that. Even though you might say that, and my argument would be that their rationality is simply influenced by their identity, by their norms, by their emotions and humiliation as well. Thank you.
I don't have good answers to your very important questions, but then I don't work in the State Department or the National Security Council, so I can afford to be just an analyst, which is what I enjoy, and a teacher, which I enjoy much more. I don't know how to satisfy Russia. This is, I think, a key geopolitical question. Do you say that there is a sphere of influence near Russia, the near abroad, where Western powers, as in Georgia, for example, should simply close their eyes to what's happening? Or should they even close their eyes on what might happen in the Baltics and perhaps renounce the NATO treaty's application to the Baltics? Would they be satisfied then? Would this sense of humiliation be overcome I mean, you mentioned very correctly what happened to Putin's popularity when he took Crimea. I also have Russian friends, and some of them are very critical of authoritarianism in Russia. In fact, most of those who talk to me are. And they welcomed the move into the Crimea. They felt better because they felt that it was part of Russia, and finally we were kicking ass, excuse my expression, a little Americanism here. And look, what can the United States or NATO do? Nothing. The answer is nothing, because we're not going to go to war over it. The problem is that if you begin to think of giving Russia and others emotional satisfaction, because that is what we're talking about, in my judgment, then you run into enormous political problems. I will just mention one. Zbigniew Brzezinski, I hope you all know, I think Michal was here much too shy to mention that the Czech edition of the book that I edited came out yesterday. And unfortunately, you're not selling it here. Well, you should, because I would sign it and for no money at all. Anyway, Brzezinski is a great geopolitical thinker. Maybe one of the two the United States has had in the last few decades, aside from Henry Kissinger. And he wrote an article after the Ukrainian crisis in Financial Times, where extremely diplomatically and very cautiously he raised the possibility that, given Ukraine's neighborhood with Russia and historical association, and given the fact that the United States is very far from Ukraine, that perhaps a compromise solution could be found. And one that he mentioned was that Ukraine would not be offered membership in NATO. Well, even this kind of compromise is politically very dangerous. Now, luckily, Brzezinski he's even older than I am, so he can afford to say things. He doesn't really much care about criticisms or reactions anymore. And so he can speak candidly, which is wonderful. The only good thing about old age that I can think of. But, it didn't get anywhere. Because then a politician would get up and say, well, you are selling out the freedom and independence of Ukraine. That's a decision by the people of Ukraine. And all these, well, you can call them slogans, but it's very real. I mean, who are we to tell? Who is Brzezinski to tell the Ukrainians that they cannot apply for NATO membership? And yet, I think a declaration of that sort by NATO, I think, would have calmed the waters to some extent, and at least for the time being, the Russians might well have considered other methods of satisfying their shaky egos, and not by foreign aggression. But, the political impossibility of doing this. But I'm looking at, I didn't want to talk, I hope you will talk here about Czech foreign policy all day today and tomorrow, and I look forward to listening. But, there are things here that you can do. I'm not going to intervene in your internal affairs. But can I do? Yeah, okay. I do as my hosts tell me to do, at least for 2 days. Well, you have alternatives here, okay? Foreign policy, you can orient yourself towards Germany and the transatlantic ties on the one hand, or you can orient yourself towards the South and the East. That's a choice. It's a very important choice. And, again, in rational terms, the argument should be very easy to make. Emotionally, no. But in rational terms, very easy to make. 80% of your trade is with the European Union, and of that, about half, I was told by Michal last night, about 40% with Germany. Well, and of course, the transatlantic ties are important because of NATO and because of the remote possibility that the Czech Republic could be, security could be in some trouble at some point in history, okay? So to me, the choice is so very obvious, except that emotionally there are Czechs who remember what Germany did, and they don't want to depend and rely on a Germany with the kind of past they used to have, or perhaps the arrogance they still have, and especially America, which after all, you can mention, we did Iraq, we did Vietnam before that, how many mistakes, and we may have good people in sports, not in hockey or tennis, but in all the others, we are doing very, very well, and it's a little too much America, domination, Germany. And so let's be free. But the idea of being free of Germany or of NATO is really just counterproductive. It doesn't make sense. So what can you do? Well, you can strengthen those ties and argue rationally with those who maintain that the European Union is foolish, that the European Union, even I hear one of your leading politicians gave an interview, last week? Let me not mention his name because you will know who I'm talking about, and who says, well, smoking should be permitted. That's a restriction on freedom. Well, I was a pipe smoker for 45 years of my life, and I don't have to go to a restaurant. I don't smoke anymore, but you don't have to go to a restaurant to prove that you are free and independent. This to me makes very little sense. So yes, there are things to do, and you can vote. I have to tell you that I'm not politically active. Certainly the last thing that as a professor I would do is go from house to house to try to convince people to vote for a candidate. I had never done it before. Now I do. I go with my wife and we distribute literature, trying to convince people that they should vote. And so, yes, I go there, and we contribute financially to the campaign of Mrs. Clinton, because the alternative is unacceptable. So if you feel that it's dangerous, what some of your politicians say or do, well, you have to campaign, you have to pay money, and you have to try to reduce discussions to rational terms rather than allowing emotions to replace the common sense.
Thank you very much. I cannot help but to join the discussion only very quickly, because what it seems to me is that we are getting close to a real transformation of political legitimacy. That the deliberative process and democracy as kind of a transmission belt of people will change, even if we want or not. And now the crucial thing is who will be leading the process of the change. Anyway, I hope that the organizers will not kill me for running slightly into the coffee break, and so that we can have at least 2 or 3 brief questions for Professor Gati or for Petr Kratochvíl. So who would like to start? So I see Mr. Sestai, Roman Joch, and Benjamin Tellison. I'm afraid that will be about it. So let us start with Mr. Sestai.
Thank you so much, Professor Gati, and thank you for the hosts. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission of the Hungarian Embassy here in Prague. As Hungary has already ratified the climate agreement of Paris this year, not many European Union countries have done so yet. Hungary is also hosting a water summit in November. So I'm asking whether on real important issues, global issues, climate change, does multilateralism still have a chance We are just currently under the United Nations General Assembly. So does Professor see a chance for multilateral diplomacy to take us through the next level? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let us take the questions together. So Dr. Joch, please.
Thank you, Professor Gati, for your presentation and brilliant analysis. I liked very much until your last remarks on the children of light and children of darkness. First of all, Reinhold Niebuhr was a Christian theologian and a realist. He knew that there are no children of light, neither children of darkness, because the border between evil and goodness is in the soul of every person. But that's not my point. My major point is that the remark, putting all people who support centralization and aid to refugees among children of light and their opponents to the other camp, to the, so to speak, basket of deplorables, are those remarks sensitive towards opponents who could have goodwill and rational arguments for their positions? Doesn't such remarks contribute to the hardening of the hearts of those people who are frustrated, angry, and not well educated in the backlash, and contributing to making them mad, bad, and dangerous?
Okay, thank you very much. We're getting to a little discussion here, which I very much enjoy. And let us see what Benjamin Tallis has to say.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Gati. Benjamin Tallis from the Institute of International Relations. Just a couple of observations on your talk. In the UK, we had a similar phenomenon that you described happening in the 50s and 60s in the US. In the UK, the signs would say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Also, I'm reliably informed by my parents and their generation. I wonder, though, if your analysis of the Great Society as creating losers from white males exactly plays into the idea that this has been a zero-sum game and reinforces the idea that there are necessarily losers from progressive social processes. Does this not actually make it harder rather than easier to persuade people if we continue to reproduce this zero-sum analysis? Secondly, on the internet, I think all of the criticisms you make could have been made of Gutenberg's great technological advance many years previously. The vulgarity that was unleashed, particularly directed at the Pope and others in 16th century etchings, highly reproducible woodcuts and so on and so forth, really came to mind when you were talking about the current level of debate. Perhaps we need to be dealing more with the socio-political ramifications of technology rather than the technology itself. Very finally, on Hungary, if the EU wants to find a way to kick Hungary out, it can do it. And frankly, if within a liberal bloc no cost is imposed for voting for people like Viktor Orban internally, it should be imposed externally. There has to be sanction, there has to be cost. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I can see that we moved to a little heated place here, and I would like to hear what Charles has to say to it.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think this is heated at all. This is the least that my provocations deserve. And I thank you very much for your comments. I think multilateralism very much is alive, and in fact, I don't think there is any alternative to it. Certainly, that's what I observe, and that's what I even hope for. And the great multilateral institutions can only, you know, proceed and make for a better world. So I certainly, as Petr mentioned before, some issues as climate change, for example, how else could they be done on a national basis? To go back to that point, by the way, the article that you referred to in Foreign Affairs, which I plan to discuss tonight at dinner, was written by a colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins University. So, but we totally disagree about things, and we'll discuss that. Well, the other two comments are actually somewhat similar, and I very much appreciated that if I gave the impression that the children of light ought to get together and in effect move against the children of darkness, I certainly didn't mean to create that impression. Obviously, they have to be convinced and persuaded, and some of them could be, but it's just very, very difficult. I think we do have, as I tried to say, we have a different circumstance about the role of emotions in political life that we did not have before, at least in recent decades. At wartime, yes, but not in the last, let's say, 70, 75 years. So when you reduce the emotional component of political attitudes, then I think it is possible, and it is imperative actually, to reach out to as many others as possible. So I'm sorry if I created the wrong impression, but I am delighted to hear your familiarity with Niebuhr's thinking. I think he was an extremely important, more realpolitik than I am, but still a great philosopher and political analyst. Now, about Ben's comment there, yes, persuade, not zero-sum game, I couldn't agree more. And the white males as losers, well, that was just quick identification here. Obviously, I'm a white male. I never felt I may be a loser in some other ways. I play card games and I lose, but whatever. No, but in sociological terms, I think you can say that those who didn't even finish high school in America, white males, felt entitled to a certain position in American life that they no longer enjoy. So in that sense, yes, I am willing to generalize, but recognizing that there are very important exceptions as well. As for Hungary, I'm not an expert on European Union law, and I take your comment seriously that it might be possible if they really wanted to. On the other hand, you know, there are countries that would not vote for that, and they have to vote for it. There has to be some kind of consensus. I think the foreign minister of Luxembourg just really overshot and listened to his own emotions. Now, I realize the frustration that several West European leaders have had with Mr. Orban, including, most importantly, Chancellor Merkel, and which is, I think, a huge mistake for Hungary. But that's a different issue altogether. Yes, they're frustrated with him, and they can do some things. You are absolutely right, and I probably should have said that. Yeah, they can do some things. They can hold up some of the cohesion fund money, for example, if they wanted to. Yes, that should be possible. But the moment there is a proposal by Luxembourg or any other country to expel Hungary, well, Poland will veto it the very next moment, maybe Slovakia too. I don't know how the Czech Republic would respond, but I think there would be, and others. I think the Irish would. I think Spain would. It's just, there is no consensus about something like this, all the more so because some of these countries would think if it can happen to X, it can happen to us as well. And so I think this is I understand the emotions behind the frustration here, but you know, that's not serious. I guess we disagree a little bit. I don't think this is serious stuff.
Thank you very much. So, well, we are just ready for a coffee break. I would like to thank very much Petr and to Charles for joining us for the first opening salvo of the symposium. I enjoyed that very much. Please join me in thanking them. And And if you allow me a few technical remarks, I would just like to add one more important two more important thanks. One is going to the U.S. Embassy, which helped us greatly in making the Charles Gati trip possible, and to the program committee of the symposium that was very much helping us in getting it together. What I would like to say is that at 11:30 there will be a special part of the symposium will begin. It is a special part which is co-organized with the help of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. It's a special dimension of the symposium, and it's called Visegrad Group and Germany Partnership in Troubled Times. We have a lot of troubled topics in our symposium, and I'm actually happy that we kind of moved into this direction with the last question. And the second technical remark is that, as you can see from the program, we will try a new thing at the symposium, which is to have breakout sessions, which means that now we will convene here for the first panel of that special event, and then we will redistribute around the ministry according to your interests, and I hope it will work for you. So thank you for joining us for the first panel, and I will see you here in 20 minutes, still in the Great Hall, for the first panel of the symposium.